Hello, folks. This is the introduction to the security part of the course. And let me just share my screen so you can see the slides. I can move myself a little bit out of the way so you can get to see the text on the slides. Okay, good. So, what are the learning goals of the course? Well, they're here. They're quoted from the course description. It says you should be able to describe and classify techniques used to obtain security of IT systems, and further assess and compare solutions to IT security problems. What that means in other terms is that you should know which tools do we have in our security toolbox, and what are those tools good for, and what are they not good for. Okay, this you'll find during the course that the security material is more, let's say, lightweight than the distributed systems part of the course. There are two reasons for this. One is that the course is hard enough work anyway. There's lots of implementation and coding work you have to do. So it's nice to have a break from time to time. But also, in particular, the cryptography material, which is part of the security stuff, is treated in much more depth in a whole bunch of master courses that you can follow later on in your studies. So there is much more to say about that part than what we have time to say in this course. Now for the actual thing, what is IT security, first of all? Even that is not so easy to answer, in fact. It turns out that every textbook in the area, if you open the thing, they will define IT security slightly differently from each other. There is agreement, though, it seems, that IT security is about reaching some general security goals. And the most important ones of those are confidentiality, authenticity, and availability. I'll get back to in a moment what those are exactly. But it's also important to talk about what IT security is not. So in particular, it's not about reliability and correctness of programs. So about do software actually do what we want it to do. Of course, that is closely related to security. You'll see later on in the course that some of the worst security problems we have exactly occur because software doesn't work the way we want it to. It's something different from what the programmer thought. There are bugs. And that's relevant, of course, but the point is, even if we live in some imaginary world where we were all perfect gentlemen, no one was trying to attack anyone, correctness of software would still be an issue we had to worry about. And conversely, even if all our software worked perfectly correctly, we would still have to worry about attacks on systems in real life. So those issues really are different. So about those general security objectives, so confidentiality, of course, is about making sure that data only becomes known to those that are supposed to have access. And it's important to emphasize this applies to data at all times, whether they're being stored on disk, whether they're being processed by the CPU, or they're being communicated on the internet. And of course, it has to be this way because we don't get to choose when and where we are attacked. Authenticity then is about kind of the dual thing, if you will. We want to make sure that data can only be modified by those that are allowed to do so. This applies to the content of the data itself, that's often known as integrity, but a subtlety is that this also applies to the user's belief, for instance, about the content. So as an example, say I get a mail saying, "I hate you." Of course, what that means to me depends heavily on who I believe that message is coming from. So full-fledged authenticity is not just about the content of the data, but also, for instance, about the source of the data, whether that can be verified or not. Finally, there's availability. That's simply the idea that we can make sure that we can always get our data when we need them. So this is about backups, replication of servers and stuff like that. Good. So it's all well and fine, of course, that we can talk about security objectives in sort of in this way, a very high level, very intuitively. But if we are actually going to design and implement secure systems, we're going to need something which is more precise. So in particular, you need to specify what is it that we want. What are exactly our security objectives in this particular setting? The general principle here is don't design a solution until you know what you want. That would seem sensible to me, at least. So to make sure what we want, we need to specify something called a security policy. So that's a thing that is, first of all, a specification of what is the system that we want to protect. And secondly, what are the security goals? What are the security objectives? Which events do we want to allow? Which events don't we want to allow? This thing can be very, very formal and very sort of mathematical, if you will. You could choose to see the entire system, all the machines in the system, as one big state machine, where the state is specified by everything that's on disk, all the bits in every register in the system. And of course, this is going to define a huge set of possible states the system might be in. And then it would be very simple to specify the security policy. I could simply say, those states over here, those are the secure states. I like those states. These other states are insecure. I don't like those. And then I would simply say, I'm not going to allow any event in my system that will move the system from a secure state to an insecure state. That's fine, but of course, it's not really an operational way to think about this at all. It would be very, very hard to understand what such a policy actually means. So therefore, security policies are usually much less formal. They'll be pieces of text in human readable language, usually. And they will also often contain some high-level description of the strategies we're going to use in order to reach those goals. Here's a small example of maybe part of a security policy. It's a text that says the following: we want to avoid virus attacks on the company's machines. Therefore, all machines must have antivirus software installed, and each person responsible for a machine has to ensure that this software is updated as needed. So even if that's a very short piece of text, it still is a security policy, roughly speaking, according to the definition. It says, which system are we talking about? It's the company's machines. What is the goal? Well, we want to avoid virus attacks. We don't want to be in a state where there's virus on any of the machines. And there's no overall strategy. We want to use antivirus software. And there are some thoughts about how you want to distribute the responsibility for this actually happening. So that can be a good example, though of course security policies in real life will usually be much longer pieces of text. It can also be useful maybe to contrast this with what a security policy isn't. So imagine, for instance, that the manager of the company goes online and says something like, IT security is very important for this company. We take it very seriously, and we work every day very hard to make sure that nobody successfully attacks our system. So as you can hear, this is not a security policy, right? This is a political statement, or even it might be called media bullshit if you want to be less kind. It can be good to contrast these things. The second thing I want to talk about here is, so once we know what our goals are, what might prevent us from reaching those goals? Well, the attacks that we might be exposed to. And of course, any system is exposed to attacks. It can be from our own users who may have good intentions, but just happen to be unlucky and press the wrong button. It can be malicious users on the inside. It can be external hackers. And in order to deal with this, we need something called a threat model. And what this is a specification of the attacks we want to protect ourselves against. And of course, indirectly, that means it's also a specification of those we are not going to worry about. You might say that why can't we be ambitious? Shouldn't we be much more ambitious and protect against all attacks? But of course, that's simply not possible, usually, or at least certainly totally impractical. For instance, if you place a large data center in Denmark, you will not be protecting that data center against the consequences of a volcanic eruption, for instance. The risk of this happening is so small that it would be completely uneconomical to try to do this. So it doesn't make sense to cover everything. Another reason why we should make sure, therefore, that we are explicit about what we are going to cover is because if we have decided that some attack is so unlikely that we're not going to worry about that. That may be a good decision in the current situation, in the current setting that we live in. But later on, as a system lives several years maybe, and the world around it evolves, maybe that attack becomes relevant, becomes a real threat. Then it better be the case that somebody remembers that now we have to do something. And of course, that's only possible if somebody actually explicitly stated the threat model at the time when the system started. It's also crucial to be conscious about which threat model you use, because a system can well be secure under one threat model, but on another one, it's totally insecure. So let me give you an example. Think of a system, a multi-user Unix-style system like the one we have at this institute here. Such a system will have a system administrator, a super user, who will have a super user password, right? So let's assume that the way in which we store this password is the administrator writes down the super user password on a piece of paper and places that piece of paper on the desk in his office. Okay. So would you guys think that's a secure solution? Well, I would assume that most of you guys would immediately, by reflex, say, of course, that's not secure, it's totally insecure. And you might be right. But let's assume that we change the assumptions a little bit. Let's say that now we place two big guys with Kalashnikov rifles outside the office of the system administrator. They're there 24/7. Nobody gets out, nobody gets in except the system administrator. So now think about the password on the desk solution. Is it now secure? Well, it certainly looks much less dangerous now, right? So the point here is that when I asked you the question in the first place, is this a secure approach? I was cheating a little bit because I didn't say what the threat model was. And the question, is this secure, really only makes sense if you have first thought about what is the threat model, what are the relevant attacks. And the point was further that now when you by reflex thought that's not going to be secure, you were probably imagining a threat model in which somebody could walk into the office and look at the piece of paper on the desk. And then when we introduced the guys with the Kalashnikovs, we changed the assumptions on the world so that this attack was no longer a relevant attack. So the threat model changed, and therefore the system was more secure, at least, than before. So that's about the threat model. And the final ingredient that we need is what's called security mechanisms. So this means once we have decided what is the goal of our system, what are the security objectives, which attacks are we going to worry about, then what are we going to put into the system, which tools are we going to use in order to make sure that it really behaves according to the security policy, even under those attacks that we have specified. So this covers anything that you might want to use, like physical locks, ID cards, passwords, cryptography, what have you, the whole thing. So once we have all this, yeah, I should mention that there's sometimes this unclear dividing line between the security policy and the mechanisms. But usually, as I said before, security objectives, general strategies are usually in the policy, but the concrete technical solutions are considered part of the mechanisms. Okay, so then we have this basic equation, let's say, of IT security. A secure system is something that you may have if you have a well-defined security policy, you have a carefully designed threat model, and you have the appropriate security mechanisms. And once we have all this well-defined, we can start asking the basic billion-dollar question, is it secure? Of course, as should hopefully be clear by now, is you can only really ask that question relative to the choices we made. What are the security objectives? What are the attacks that are relevant? What are the mechanisms? But even if everything is well defined, unfortunately, it's really, really hard to be sure. Of course, you might say, given that we are scientists here, why should we accept not being sure? Can't we prove security? So doing that would mean we'd have to build a mathematical model of the system. We'd have to prove a theorem then saying that the system never behaves in a way we don't want. And that's, of course, a very honorable goal to have. But unfortunately, you will usually run into one out of two problems here. Either you have to find a very general threat model, so general that in fact it covers almost anything. But then it's usually really, really hard, sometimes even impossible, to prove security. It might even be the case that the question of whether you satisfy the policy turns out to be an undecidable question. Undecidability is something that you probably heard about before, and it basically just means that there's no possibility of proving security in that case. Or it can be the case that the threat model is limited enough that we can actually prove something, but then, of course, we have to face the risk that we might be subjected to an attack that's not covered in the model. So there's kind of a dilemma there that we cannot really escape usually, which is sad. But of course, we will do the course anyway. First of all, because even incomplete results are useful. And second, security is important out there. So just because our theory is not complete, that's no excuse, of course, for not caring about security in real life. Okay, so as a consequence of all this, unfortunately, we have to admit to the fact, or live with the fact, that no real system ever is 100% secure. It just doesn't exist in real life. Sad, but that's just the world we live in. The further consequence, therefore, is that actually asking if it's secure and expecting a yes or no answer, well, that actually doesn't make any sense. It's something you often see in the media somewhere, say, if a bank has had some security problems, somebody has attacked their system, and of course they have to do something about this. And then maybe the system administrator has to go in television and answer questions about this. Then, of course, the journalist will ask him, okay, so now after you've done all this work, is your system now secure? Yeah. And of course, that's a yes or no answer. And you will find that the poor guy who is being interviewed, he can't really answer the question, which is not because he's trying to hide something, but actually because the question itself doesn't make any sense. The good question, the question that would make sense, is it secure enough? Right? Because because we cannot cover every attack, there's no 100% security. The question should rather be those attacks, or one version of the question should be those attacks that we haven't protected ourselves against. Is it true that they are so expensive, so cumbersome to carry out that no adversary would bother about trying them? If that's the case, then we can reasonably say that the system is secure enough. We've put the bar high enough for the attacker. Of course, it's a better question. Of course, the answer is much more complicated. It takes longer time, probably much more time than the few seconds you're allowed to speak on television. So that's why we have a problem here. But for us who have more time to think about things, we have to admit to the fact that this is the conditions we have to live under. Good. So just to tell you something about what you can expect, the approach for the security part of the course will be a bottom-up approach. We're going to start with technology and security mechanisms, the sort of bit-fiddling part of the stuff. We will continue with various kinds of security policies and ways you can design them. And finally, we'll talk about how to design threat models, and we'll look at a bunch of examples, war stories from real life, threats and pitfalls, things that went wrong in history, so that hopefully you can learn from these pitfalls and not fall into them yourself when you have to go out there and do stuff. And that was the end of the lecture. See you next time.